Hey guys, Daz here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to pattern and make this anthro werewolf. I'm really excited to show you guys this pattern and sort of my first anthro pattern that I've made as a tutorial, so I hope that it's very enlightening and I hope that you like making a bunch of plushies with this cool pattern. So let's get started and I'll show you how we're going to put the pattern together today. Alrighty, so I'm going to do something a little bit different to what I normally do in these tutorials, guys. What I usually do is I take you through me developing the pattern from scratch from the very start. But as I want to sort of make these patterns nicer and nicer as I'm giving you the finished version, it really hinders me in the patterning process to, I guess, film and narrate every single step of patterning. So what I've done here is I've actually finished the pattern, refined it, made it a few times, tweaked it to make it look really nice. And I'm going to go back and show you how I came to make each of those pattern pieces rather than sort of documenting each step. Whereas, the earlier iterations of the pattern, I might not even use certain elements of it. So I'm showing you how I made, I guess, the final version of the pattern rather than, bogging myself down having to film everything. So I hope this still works. I'm going to go through each element of the pattern and I'm going to show you how to achieve that. But what we're going to be looking at is the final polished pattern. So what I started off with is my side view of the werewolf, just the general shape that I wanted him to be. I know I wanted sort of a bipedal, very buff kind of werewolf with, like a small torso and a big chest and a big sort of thick neck, like a big scruffy mane, that sort of thing. So this is my terrible werewolf drawing, but it's what I based this pattern off of. So I just did a side drawing because obviously werewolves are fictional. You can go and look up, images of movie werewolves and things if you want a good reference, but you probably will have to draw your own side reference if you're making your own custom werewolf pattern. And for the front, I knew that really all I needed was the general shape of the torso. I didn't really need to know what the wolf's face looked like from the front because that's pretty standard to pattern a dog. It's wide at the back and narrow at the front. And the legs were just going to be two pieces of this side shape, so I didn't really need to draw them from the front either. So I'll go along and I'll show you how I patterned each piece. So for the leg, you can see that I've traced over the leg that I've drawn and I've just refined the shape a little bit. I also lengthened it up the top here so that this could wrap around the back of the torso and we could hand stitch this to the torso. So this is sort of like the butt section, I guess. So if you're making an anthro pattern that is sort of the same shape where sort of you have your thighs and then the thighs merge into the buttocks at the back, all you really need to do is trace the side of your little wolfy legs. And then to make the paw pad shape, all I did was essentially I drew what I would like a paw pad to look like. So I'll just take you through that, doing that from scratch. And really you can draw the paw pad in whatever kind of shape you want. I just sort of drew what I wanted roughly the foot to look like. I wanted it to be a little bit longer than like a standard dog's foot. So let's say we want the bottom of our foot to look something like that. I'm going to bring it over to the bottom of our leg. And what I did is, because this bottom of the foot is going to be sewn against this half of our sort of bottom foot, I just went ahead and I started at this sort of front section where they merge, and I'm just keeping these seam lines together, rotating the bottom of the paw along the line of the bottom of our foot. And then I'm adding some little key reference marks. So I like to add them sort of wherever there's like a sharp curve and roughly in the middle. So let's say we add that marking in the middle there if we were using this paw pattern. If we kept rotating it along. And then we could go ahead on our leg. We could add that marking there. And just keep going until you've rotated it all the way to the end. You might need to either make your paw pad shape a little bit shorter, or you could also make this foot shape a little bit longer, just so that they match each other in length. But if that didn't make sense, I've got a whole separate tutorial on how to pattern paws if you want to go into a bit more depth on how to create your paw pad shape and the side shape of your foot. But that's essentially all we're going to do for our legs. If we keep going from the bottom upwards, so once we've done our legs, the next thing we want to pattern is our torso. So I just went ahead and did a sort of a more refined drawing of this sketch I did of the rough torso shape. You can see that what I've done is there's a centre line down the middle. I just sketched out half of the torso shape and then I flipped it over so that it was nice and symmetrical. I also went ahead and I added in some key points. So I added this line here at the shoulder, this one here sort of where the bottom of the pecs are going to be, this one here where sort of the crotch turns into, you know, where the thigh is going to be, sort of thing. Just key points that are going to help us make our gusset. So what I ended up doing is I made a gusset, which is like a long strip of fabric, and this is half, so we're going to have one strip of fabric going down this side and one strip of fabric going down this side here. So all I did to pattern that, so I put down all my key markings. I drew a straight line, which is the line you can see in the middle here. And what that's going to do is it's going to form like a long loop, like a long piece of fabric that forms into a long and skinny loop. So we're going to have one piece in this shape for the front of the chest and one again for the back. And between those two pieces, you're going to have that long loop. The reason why I don't just do one single piece of fabric is that I like the nap or the direction of Minky to be going down rather than, you know, it's going down on this side but then up on this side. It's just a little bit neater to split that loop in two and have the fur going down this direction and down in this direction. It just looks a lot neater. So to make that gusset, all I did was I drew a straight line, roughly the length that I thought this line here would be if it was straight. And remember that we're only patterning half because we're having two of these strips. So I'm going to start the top of my line at the top of the chest here, and I'm just going to rotate it along that outer line. So you could, if you were doing this on a piece of paper, you could just use something like a flexible measuring tape. And then we're just going to go along and transfer those key marks, those key points, onto our straight line. So now we want to turn this into sort of the fleshed out piece. So we're just going to bring it back straight again, and we're just going to think, okay, at this section here, how much width do we want between this front piece and the back? And it's not a whole lot. You can see this is the overall width that we ended up with for this point. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to mark what I think the width is, but I'm going to halve it. So I'm only going to draw this side, not this side, because then we can flip this over and it'll be nice and symmetrical. So you can bring out your marks. You can number them as well if that helps. And I'm just going to look at each of these points and think, okay, which points do I want them wider? Where do I want it thinner? And you can see that I sort of had a medium width at the top here, medium width, then it sort of gets a little bit skinnier as it goes all the way down sort of the sides of his body and down into the crotch sort of thing. So then I would just connect all my lines, so it's something like that. And then flip that over so it's nice and symmetrical. And that's how we get our side gusset piece. So now we've done our leg, we've done our torso. You would think that the next part we would do is the neck, But what I actually did, because the neck is sort of an unusual shaped pattern, is I next went ahead and patterned the head, and then after I patterned the head, I manually patterned the neck using a method that I'll show you in a second. So here we have our two pieces that make up our head. So we have our side headpiece, of which there will be two, so one for each side of the head. And then we have our gusset, which is our strip of fabric that runs all the way between those two side headpieces. So first off, we draw the side of our head, and you can see here that this differs a tiny bit from the initial sketch. Really, I just cleaned up the shape and I made the brow a little bit higher, because when I was testing out this pattern, just having the brow down here to make it a bit more obvious. And I've gone ahead and I've marked out several points along our side head pattern, and these are just points that I think are useful for creating the gusset, so anywhere where there's sort of a big change in direction. So here at the brow, here at the bottom where the eyes are, at the nose, at the bottom of the chin, and just sort of adding a bunch in between as you need them. So we do that, and then we repeat the same process that we did before to make the gusset. You draw a long straight line. In this case, we're starting here at the back of the head, and then so you can see here I have point 1, this is point 1 here, here's point 2 along the side, here's point 3, etc, etc, going all the way around the head. And in this case, for the wolf, I just knew that the back of the head will be quite wide, so you can see this is quite wide, this is quite wide, and then the area at the front of the nose would be quite thin. So I just did the same as we did before, marking out all our points on a straight line, drawing reference marks horizontally, marking out sort of the width, and then connecting all the dots, and then flipping that over so we have a nice symmetrical gusset. And that's it. It's a pretty simple head to put together. It doesn't have any darts or anything like that. And another thing that we need to pattern is the pecs. So we have our torso here, and you can just ignore these little bits here. So to create the pecs, all I did was make a copy of this section here, dragged it sort of outwards, and I just chopped off this bit here and made this bit sag down a little bit here, and then we have the pattern for both our pecs. Now to do the eyebrow on our face, all I did was sketch out roughly what shape I would like our eyebrow to be, and then I traced that, so not very hard. You can even after you've made your head and stuffed it, you can get a piece of paper and sort of sit that onto the surface of your plush head and draw the shape of your eyebrows. If you want to do it that way, you don't have to do them the same as I've done them here. You can make them a lot meaner, you can make them skinnier, you can make them more cartoony and bulky, you can do whatever you like with that. So another thing that we can now pattern is the ear. So you can see that if you ignore these sections here, all I've really done is kind of traced over the rough shape that I wanted the ear to be. I sort of flanged it out here after looking at some references. And we want there to be some little sections that fold over at the bottom. So all you need to do is extend it sort of across like in a triangle, and then we can fold these sections over at sort of this fold line, and they're going to fold forwards. So in the end, your ear will look something like that. So it'll have these nice folds that come over to make it look a bit more like a real wolf ear or a bunny ear or whatever you want it to look like. So initially I patterned these to face backwards, but you can also face them up. You could also modify this and make more like a standard wolf, like pointy triangle ear. It just depends on what your werewolf that you're making, what their ears happen to look like. You can also sew some quilt batting into the middle of those ears to make them a little bit more rigid. I would definitely recommend this if you're making some very long ears like this, just so that they can hold their own shape. Now the arms are a little bit more complicated, so just ignore these excess pieces for a second. Just ignore that one. So initially I just drew what I thought the arm would look like this. Then I added a dart to the top. I have some tutorials on adding both a basic and complex darts in a separate video. And then what I wanted to do is I wanted the shoulder to sort of bulge out. Like if you look at bodybuilders, they sort of have that section at the top of their shoulder that's very puffy, and then it'll sort of go back into their normal arm. So what I did is I made a copy of this section here and dragged that over separately, and I widened the bottom sort of area of it and added these two little darts, and these two little darts will make this shoulder section puff out a bit more. So really when you're sewing this arm together for say one arm, we would have two of this bottom piece here and two of the shoulder piece here, and you would sew all the darts, and then this line, once those darts are sewn, should be the same length as this line, and you can sew them together. And that's just going to give you a little puff out at the top of the shoulder there, which looks especially nice if you're making a very strong looking werewolf. But if you want to keep things simple, you can just get rid of this line here, not even worry about this piece, just sew that top dart and sew two of these pieces together, and that will just give you, an arm that is essentially the same shape that I made for the werewolf pattern, but it won't have that muscly section at the top, but it is much easier to sew. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go over how to pattern the neck. And because the neck is sort of this big, broad mass, it's not so easy to pattern, I guess, digitally or just on paper. So what I decided to do is I sort of suspended the head where I wanted it to sit in relation to the body. I just used a very long doll needle, so it's like a 6-inch or 10-inch long needle. Drove it through the head and sort of into the torso to suspend the head in the position I wanted it to be. And then what I did is I got some of this sort of quilt batting and I just wrapped it around the neck a bunch of times and sort of formed it into that swooping shape that I wanted the neck to be. You only need to do this for half because it's symmetrical, so you can just pattern half of the neck and flip it over to cover the other side. But what I did is I cut out several dozen different little pieces of duct tape and I crisscrossed them all over this form that we've made here for the neck, and then I cut them off the neck, and it gave me sort of like a bulging piece of tape for half the neck, and then I just had to make one cut in it so that it would lay flat, so that made this big dart here. So this is essentially the pattern shape to recreate that bulging neck shape that we had sculpted. You can use things like clay, you could use tin foil, but I just had that cotton batting on hand, so that's how I generated our head shape. And then I traced over it, and this is the pattern that I came up with. So I ended up, instead of making the dart end here, I just brought it up a little bit further, so we have like two separate pieces, so they're not necessarily connected. So these are the two pieces that form one half of our neck. This is the front, and this piece here gets sewn to this piece here, which will make sort of that nice curve that we see from the front of the neck. Now, if we want to sew the neck in faux fur, we need to account for the fact that the faux fur has fluff or width to itself, so we actually need to make our neck piece smaller. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to take maybe an inch off the top of our neck pattern here, and then I would just get rid of the top of it here. And that's just going to make it so that our neck is approximately the same shape as it would have been in the minky, but we're sewing it in the faux fur that has that sort of poof to it. So this bit is still going to get sewn to this bit, but in the faux fur. Another thing that we can pattern is the tail. I just brought up the sketch that we did of the initial werewolf. I drew out a tail that was kind of more of a realistic wolf shape, but the werewolf I ended up making, her reference had more of this swooshy, like reverse S shape. So you can just sketch that out, you know, whatever shape you think your tail will need to be. Again, if you are using faux fur, you need to make this pattern a little bit smaller to account for the fluff of the faux fur. So I ended up using this pattern for her tail, but I took about that much off to just allow for the fluff of the faux fur. I don't tend to like to sort of make the whole thing skinnier because that just makes it harder to sew. So I usually just sort of cheat and take the width of the faux fur off like the top of the pattern or wherever it's easiest to chop that pattern off there. And for the hand pattern, I just drew out and patterned a hand as I normally would. I have a whole separate tutorial on how I pattern hands, so if you want to go and have a look at the best way to pattern like a human hand, you can go and watch that tutorial. But you can see here's one of the earlier hands that I patterned, and I realised that they needed longer fingers, so you can see here that I just added length to those fingers there. And this is our final hand pattern that I ended up using. But I like to keep the hand separate to the arm pattern, just that I can rotate it. You know, you might want to have it, you know, the hand might be horizontal, whereas the seams on the arm might want the hand to be vertical. So I just like to keep those separate so that you can hand sew the hand onto the arm at whatever angle you happen to want to use. So that's pretty much all the patterning process that went into making this plush. So let's go ahead and I'll show you how to actually put it together. So I'm going to be taking you through hopefully an easier method of showing you how all these pieces get sewn together. So I'm going to start off with sewing the head, and the first thing we need to do is we need to turn our gusset into one long loop. So you're going to sew the top to the bottom, and you're going to leave a little gap because that's where we're going to put our stuffing into. So now that this long sort of hourglass piece is a sort of long loop, you want to start sewing the side pieces to the corresponding sides of the gusset. And I would recommend just doing one piece at a time, especially around that brow and nose area, because we've got a lot of very abrupt sort of angle changes. So you can see that I would recommend just sewing the front of the mouth to the corresponding gusset length on both sides, and then you can sew like the bridge or the top of the snout to its corresponding gusset piece, and then sew that vertical part of the brow, and just take it one side at a time, one little bit at a time. And then once you've done sort of all those areas that have abrupt angle changes, you can go ahead and you can finish sewing the rest of your loop around the rest of your head. I would just recommend doing those little small pieces one bit at a time, because if you try and sew it all at once, you often don't get those very sharp angles, which will really help you get the different sections of the head. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to sew our brows together. And obviously for each brow, you're going to need two pieces, so one for each side. So here we have all the pieces that we would need for a set of two brows. And all we're going to do is sew them together, very simple, all the way around the outside. And then once you've sewn them together, you can make like a tiny snip in the back of the brow, because this isn't going to be seen, and you can use that to turn your brow inside out. Now we can go ahead and sew our ears. You can optionally put a layer of quilt batting in when you're sewing your ears. What you want to do is you just want to sew all the way around the outside. So we're kind of ignoring those inner markings of the ears because they are sort of representative of fold lines. So to sew one ear, you would start at the bottom and you would sew all the way around the top and down. one thing that I accidentally drew at the bottom of the ear. You want to leave the bottom of the ear open because that's where you're going to be turning your ear inside out. You can optionally just leave a small gap to turn it inside out and then do that up with a ladder stitch once you're finished. But that's how you sew the ears together. And the next thing we're going to look at is how to sew the neck. I'm just going to show you how to sew the neck as if it was made out of minky, but I will also provide the faux fur sort of pattern for the neck. If you want to make it out of faux fur, I'll include that. It's exactly the same process to sew that together as it is to sew the minky version together. So the minky version is just the bulkier version of the two. But essentially all you're going to be doing is you're just going to be sewing that inner line to that inner line. So this is for half of our neck. Also do that on your other side. And then once we've done that, so we've created the two halves of our neck, then we're going to sew the front section to the front section. You want to leave that swoopy section sort of towards the middle top. That's where we're going to hand sew the opening to our head. And then we want to sew the back of the neck to the back of the neck. And that's going to create kind of like a sock with the end cut off, like a I don't know, I guess it's just neck shape, so it's open at the bottom and open at the top for where we're going to be hand sewing it onto both our shoulders and our plush's head. Now obviously for each of our legs you're going to need two pieces, one for each side. You're going to sew all the way around the outside but leaving the bottom of the foot open, because the bottom of the foot is going to be sewn to one half of the paw. So for example, this bottom of the foot will be sewn against this outer section of the paw, and the same deal for the opposite side of our leg and the opposite side of our paw. So you'll sew those together, and that's pretty much it for sewing a leg. So you'll obviously do that twice. Now for doing the torso, we're going to attach our two strips together at the top and at the bottom, and this is going to create like a nice long loop with the nap of the minky going down on both pieces. You can leave a little gap at the top where you sew them together so you can put your stuffing in through that little gap. And then I would recommend you can then go ahead and you can sew the corresponding top of the torso to the top of the loop, sort of where it matches along the edge, and then you can repeat that for the back of the torso, and then you can go ahead and just sew your other sections to their corresponding areas of the strips of the gusset. I recommend just doing one section at a time, not trying to do the whole thing at once. That'll make things a little bit complicated. You can see here sort of just tackling one side at a time. The pecs are very simple. You just need two pieces for each pec. Sew them all the way around the outside. You can either choose to leave a gap in sort of maybe the top part of where you sew the pec together, or the sides, or you could even make a little snippet on the back of the pec and use that to turn it inside out, because you're not going to be seeing that once it's attached to the actual body. Now we're going to be sewing the arms together. This is a little bit more complicated. If you want to just keep things simple, ignore that piece on the right hand side, ignore that line through the arm piece, and just sew the darts at the top and then sew the rest of your arm together. But if you want to have sort of the muscly arm like I have patterned, the first thing you would do is you would go ahead and sew all of your darts. Just do all of those. Ignore the line, ignore this top section of the arm. We don't need this for the muscle arm because it's replaced with the muscle shoulder. So we've done all of our darts, and once all those darts are sewn, you can sew the bottom of the shoulder to the top of the arm, sewing over those darts that we've just sewn there. For the darts and for all of these pieces that you're sewing, I would recommend snipping off the seam allowance so that it's not too bulky afterwards. So now our arms, the shoulder and the arm are joined, and you can just go ahead and sew all the way around the edge to create, one single arm out of two side pieces. So just imagine that those pieces are connected, the shoulder and the arm, and you want to leave the bottom, sort of where your wrist is, you want to leave that open, because that's where you're going to turn this inside out and add stuffing. It's also where you're going to be hand sewing on your hands. So doing the hands is very simple. Again, you're just sewing a hand piece to another mirrored hand piece for each hand, leaving the top open, because that's where we're going to turn it inside out and add our stuffing. The tail is about as easy as you can get. Sew all the way around the outside, leaving the top open to turn it inside out. If you are sewing it in faux fur, you might need to leave a larger gap and perhaps glue it together once it's turned inside out, or hand stitch it together once it's turned inside out, because the faux fur is very bulky and this is sort of a small tail to be sewing in faux fur, so just do whatever you need to be able to turn that inside out. So you can go ahead and stuff each of your legs, and now we're going to be adding the paws. So we're just going to be doing this with thread sculpting. If you've never thread sculpted before, there's lots of tutorials online. Just search plush or stuffed toy thread sculpting. But essentially we're just going to be using a long piece of thread doubled over on a long needle, and we're just going to be looping it around the edges of our toe shape, pulling it tight, doing that multiple times for each sort of crease you want in the foot, and that's going to give us our 4 little toes in our paw. So here you can see a finished paw and an unfinished paw. You can also see on the table I've got a long piece of thread that's been waxed so it doesn't knot easily, because you're using a very long piece of thread, and I've got a very long needle. You probably don't need one quite as long as this because the pieces of fabric you're going to be going through on this foot aren't super wide, but that's just what I had. You may have to do this more than once. I think I redid these feet a couple of times because I just didn't like the width of the toes, so just keep in mind it might not come out perfect the first time. But you've doubled over your thread. You can sort of hide the knot at the back of the foot, and sort of loop it up around the front of the toe if you're doing a 4-toe foot. So you come straight down the centre, and you can see I'm just going through the foot nice and tight with that thread, and repeating that a few times so that the thread holds itself in place and holds that sort of divot that we've created in the centre of the foot. And then we're just going to repeat this for both our other toes. If your side toes decide that they want to sort of slip to the side of the foot, you can bring your needle up and over. So you can use a pin, and you can pin the toe or the thread for the toe in the position that you want, and then once you've finished going around the foot a few times, you can bring the needle up and over that thread in just a tiny little stitch, and that will tack your toe sort of divot in place, or that thread that's creating your toe divot, and that will make sure that it stays in the position you want and it's not going to slide to the side as it wants to do. So I've gone ahead and I've stuffed our torso, and now we're going to pin our legs onto our torso. You sort of want to keep adjusting them so that I guess the crotch is as low as you want it to be. You don't want it to be too low, but you also don't want the legs to be too low on the back, but you're sort of pinning them at the centre back of our torso piece, so sort of where the butt cheeks would be, and you're pinning them firmly there, and then you're going to pull them around to the front and pin them in place so they sort of wrap around the sides of our torso. And then you can go ahead and you can just use a ladder stitch and go around each of these connections at least twice to make sure that it's nice and strong, and that's going to be held into place. And that's how we attach our legs onto our torso piece. Now we're going to attach the pecs to our body. I'm not going to be including how to do the abs section of the chest in this. I have a separate tutorial for that. So patrons for this month, if you've pledged, you should also get that tutorial. But here I'll show you how to attach just the pecs. So I've turned my pecs inside out. I'm not going to be adding any stuffing. I'm going to make sure that I've closed up the holes that I used to turn them inside out. And I'm just going to pin them into place where I want them at the top of the chest. And I'm going to do a little bit of hand sewing. I hand sew them all along the top. You could also glue them down if you want to. I used a combination of hand sewing and gluing so that you still got that nice bold ridge at the bottom of the pecs, because if you'd hand sewed that down, you would sort of blend that line rather than the glue sort of lets it still have that raised look. So you can go ahead. I've just sewn the tail, nothing too exciting there, and I've layer stitched that onto the rump of the werewolf, and now I've gone ahead and I'm pinning the unstuffed neck onto sort of the top of our body piece or our torso piece. I'm just stretching it out, making sure that it's even on both sides, putting a bunch of pins in there to hold it in place. And then what I'm going to do once that's all pinned in place is I'm going to put a bunch of stuffing in through that opening where the head's going to go. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and well stuffed, it's firm enough to hold our head up, and then I'm going to pin our head into place as well. You can see the head in the background. I've already gone ahead, I've done the embroidery, I've sewn the head, I've stuffed it, I've sewn the ears and ladder stitched them onto the face. I've glued the eyebrows onto, I guess, the top of the eyes, and I've added little details like gluing on a minky nose and gluing on some little, like a marking on the top of her face. You could choose to applique that on or embroider that on, depending on, if your werewolf has any sort of face designs. But I'm just going to stuff the neck, and then I'm going to repeat the pinning process. I'm just going to get the head in the position I want it on the neck, so you can have it more looking up or more looking down, depending on what you want to go for. And I'm just going to add a bunch of pins and pin that head on, and then you can go ahead and start the sort of tedious task of ladder stitching the mane onto the torso and as well as onto the head. I've gone ahead with a faux fur mane because I really like how that looks on this pattern. It's very sort of wild and woolly looking, but you could as well follow the exact same process that I'm doing here with a minky neck if you want a more streamlined look or you just don't want a mane. But then you can just do all your ladder stitching, then your head is attached. You're essentially then going to pin your arms in place, so pin your shoulders to the torso. You can then ladder stitch them to the torso. Then you want to stuff the hands. I didn't actually film that, but essentially you're just going to put a tiny bit of stuffing in each of the fingers. You can choose to put a little bit of wire in the fingers as well if you want to pose them. I did that here. It sort of allows you to pose them in a more natural shape than just like jazz hands, werewolf. So I would recommend that you can just use some very light gauge wire. I think I used jewellery wire in this circumstance, but you could also go ahead and use something like pipe cleaners would be really good because these fingers are so little and tiny. You can then go ahead and add claws if you want to add claws to the fingers or the toes. I just went ahead and glued minky together with hot glue, so I sort of made a double-sided minky and then cut out all my teeny little claws and then glued them onto the fingers. That's just one option. You could sculpt a bunch of little claws. I probably wouldn't sew like a double-sided or like sew in a conventional way your claws with two pieces of minky, pin them together, sew them and then turn them inside out, because the hands and the paws on this werewolf are just really tiny, so I don't think it would really be very possible to do it with that method. But do whatever you think is fitting for adding claws onto these tiny little paws and hands. And then you can go ahead and really just, once your hands are hand sewn onto the wrist, there's not too much left to do. I mean, you can just add any little final details. I went ahead and glued a little bit, a few more tufts of black hair sort of creeping up the back of her head a little bit more and around like under her ears. So I just wanted to make the mane sort of curl around her face a little bit more. But that's just something I chose to do for the look of this particular character. You don't have to do that, or you could add a lot more faux fur. You could have the fur come like right down to where the brows are on the forehead. It's just up to whatever sort of look you're going for. But that's essentially all the steps that went into making this werewolf. If you have any questions, if I missed out on something, feel free to send me a private message on like social media or Patreon or anything like that, and I'll try and help you out. One thing that I did forget to mention earlier is I did add wire to the legs because they are so long and skinny. You really do need to wire them. I have a separate tutorial on how to wire plush if you don't know how to do that. You can leave them unwired, but then the plush won't be able to stand and it'll have sort of like very bendy noodle legs, so they're not going to keep keep looking very nice, they're just going to sort of flop all over the place. But that is something that I would recommend, adding a bit of wire in there. But that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope you guys really enjoyed this tutorial. Please tag me if you make your own werewolf or sort of character using this pattern. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!